Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Aliana Kernodle. A new report from a nonprofit organization that ranks states by educational freedom found large differences between them based on their efforts to improve the school choices families have for their children. Joining me to dig into this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, tell us about this report.
Yeah, so the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a big mouthful, essentially it's a group of conservative state legislators, and they essentially create different informational reports and kind of research on these different issues. And specifically this one that they're focused on was education freedom. And so what the education freedom index or report basically does is it ranks states against each other in terms of educational freedom and specifically school choice. So that's what they're talking about with education freedom, is how can families move from school to school? Do families have different kinds of education options if it's, if they don't want to go to their public school, and kind of calculate some of those different variables there. So that in a nutshell is, who was doing the organizing, specifically Andrew Handel, who's the director of ALEC's Education and Workforce Development Task Force. He was the lead author. I spoke with him about the findings there. It was a really good conversation, and he had a lot to say about sort of what's going on. But the top view is that things are really changing in terms of school choice since in the last few years. So Handel kind of put a point on it that said, COVID was maybe the start of all of this. Like the parents were seeing maybe for the first time very closely what was going on in their kids' classrooms, because it maybe was happening at the kitchen table. Maybe they needed different kinds of education options. Maybe they were discontent with how things were handled during COVID, like with school closures or masks. There's a lot of different kinds of factors that started during COVID, but those have continued. And so he said it's no coincidence that West Virginia started its school choice program in 2021, while things were reopening, while there was some confusion. So I think that's a very interesting, factor in this conversation. And since then, there's been a lot of different school choice measures. And he said, some of that is you have West Virginia doing it, and then you have, legislators in Arizona saying, hey, we also want to have school choice. We also want to have this kind of program. And then in Florida. And so, then there is sort of a competition between, these conservative leaning Republican states of trying to figure out, okay, who can have the most education choice, right? So he's thrilled about that. And he was saying that, there's some of these big states. And, there's been some movement based on what states have passed what measures. So he said, essentially, he said that there are, top 5 states are Florida in terms of education freedom, are Florida, Arizona, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Iowa. And he said that, all of those states have universal eligibility programs, which means that if you are a student or a family with a student in those states, you can go to a private school and pay for that tuition with taxpayer funds. And so you can say, instead of sending my kid to a public school and having that being paid for, I can go to a private school of my choice and still have taxpayer funds that can be used for that tuition, and that there's no cap. So that universal eligibility focuses on allowing all students to apply for that. And so there are some states where that's a limited eligibility if you're under a certain percentage of the federal poverty line, for example, or just over it, different kinds of metrics to say, okay, we can give this to a targeted group of students where they're the highest need, for example. So universal eligibility is all families. So he said that those are the top 5. He also said that the big changes came to several states. So one of them was North Carolina. He said that jumped up 23 spots on the index, because it allowed 50,000 more students to join the school choice program. And he said that some states, went the other way. So, for example, he said Kentucky fell 16 spots down to number 46 out of 50, because the legislature had passed a tax credit ESA program, Education Savings Account program, but then the state Supreme Court struck it down. So he said without that, they didn't have as high of a score. And he said the bottom 5 states were Kentucky, because it fell down that far, and then Rhode Island, Oregon, Massachusetts, and New York. And he said that those actually surprisingly did fairly well in the charter school category, so that there are they didn't get like zeros all the way through, because even New York got some charter schools. So that was kind of the example he used, is that even New York, in the department, even New York City, there's a proliferation of charter schools, which are part of like how the Department of Education like meets the needs for all the students there. There are some charter schools. They don't necessarily work together. I've written about that too, but that is part of the schooling solution in the city. But that was the only state with zeros in 4 of the 5 categories. New York was. So it's a very, very interesting kind of thing. So he basically said, in that state, families do not have access to a lot of those other school options. They're the school choice options.
You mentioned these categories. What categories do they use to reach these rankings? Yeah,
so they essentially rank each state based on the availability of various educational environments. And so I'm kind of pulling directly from the report here, including charter schools, homeschooling, virtual schools, and public schools through open enrollment policies. So by that, and I've written about this before, and I think we've talked about it here on the podcast, is open enrollment is saying, I want to go to a different public school that's outside of where I'm zoned to go to school. So, public schools have limits around them, and even in certain districts where you could still be, like maybe in Chicago Public Schools, for example, but you have to be in a specific zone to go to this elementary school. And if you're not in that zone, too bad. So that would be like the open enrollment policy. And then it also examines the programs that each state has available to families and rates them based on how many families are able to take advantage of it and how much funding is provided. So those are the financial programs, universal eligibility, education savings accounts, for example, those different kinds of, so you can take, here's $10,000 to go to any school you want. Could be private, could be religious, could be whatever school, or if it's the public school, then it's already paid for, and the funds follow the student. So that's the idea, is how well do the funds follow the student. And for Handel and for ALEC, I think too, that they promote this. They say things like he told me there's no such thing as a one size fits all solution. So he said, quote, "It's not an attack on public schools. It's impossible to be the best school for every kid." So essentially there's this idea that, every family has students that have unique needs. And so maybe your family needs to have each kid go to a different school. If that's the best fit for them, then we should do that. So I think that's a big argument for school choice. And, the critics of school choice have often pointed out that you're taking you're taking taxpayer funds and moving it toward private or, charter schools, or, different kinds of options like that. And I think then the proponents of school choice are very quick to say, well, public schools will kind of figure it out eventually and sort of make themselves competitive. And so it is a very, very big free market sort of argument going alongside a lot of this.
Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.